And today we're fortunate to have with us the Dean of Polling in the state of Washington, who's probably done more polls than any other individual in the history, actually, in the state of Washington. Stuart Elway has been analyzing public opinion since 1975. He has directed hundreds of research projects both locally and nationally for businesses, nonprofits, government agencies, and media outlets. Stuart was the director of the Seattle Times Washington Poll from 1984 to 2000, and he started the Elway Poll in 1992, which later became the Cascade PBS Elway Poll in 2018. Stuart has appeared regularly in Northwest media, and he's been quoted or appeared on nearly every major television network and every major newspaper in the country. Stuart holds a PhD in communications. Where from? You know?
Sorry. Couldn't get into WSU.
And he's taught at the University of Washington and at Evergreen State College, and he's been an affiliated research associate at Heritage University. Join me now in welcoming Stuart Elway back to the Foley Institute.
Thank you. Great to be back here in a fine Palouse afternoon. I heard an interview with Coach Geographic the other day talking about the new recruits that are in town, and they got here in August, and now they're getting an idea of what Palouse is like when you get into fall and winter. Hoping to hold on to them. We're 2 weeks from the election. This is usually the time when I go to my undisclosed location and hide out, because the last thing I want to do, or any pollster wants to do, is start making predictions of an election, especially one that's close. I usually like to make my election predictions around Christmas time. I got most of them right over the years. This year I'm not so sure that Christmas will be soon enough. So instead of just talking about this election, I want to put it in some context and talk about the road of Washington State to become a reliably democratic state. It wasn't always like this. I know we're limited in time, so I'm going to skip over the Peloponnesian War, but this was a battleground state. A generation ago now, from 1960 to 1984. Washington split our ticket between governor and president, Democrat and Republican, in 5 out of 7 elections. Then we went to 4 straight Republican elections into 94, into 84. And then, as I said, in 2000, Washington was on the long list of battleground states. George Bush was actually going to spend money here. He decided against it, went to Ohio instead. But the last time Washington voted for a Republican for president was 1984. And we went from Ronald Reagan 1 year to Michael Dukakis in the next election. The only state in the country to do that. As a matter of fact, only 2 states that voted for Michael Dukakis, and we were one of them, after voting for 4 Republicans in a row. And I have maintained that one of the indicators, if not the reason for that, is that in 1988, the Republican State Committee sent a delegation to the National Republican Convention to vote for televangelist Pat Robertson against sitting Vice President H.W. Bush, and indicated a rightward movement in the Republican Party apparatus, and Washington has not voted for Republicans since. In 1992, Pat Buchanan declared the culture war at the GOP convention, and the Republicans have been losing that war ever since. The last Republican governor we elected was John Spellman in 1980, and he left office in 1984. And since then, the Democratic average vote has been about 55%. Open seats have been much closer. We have an open seat this year. I don't think it's going to be as close as some of the ones we've had. Most famously, there in 2004, we had the closest gubernatorial race in the history of the United States. when Christine Gregoire beat Dino Rossi by 133 votes on the third recount. But it's been Democrats ever since. Washington elects, as you know, 8 offices by party. Not only governor, but lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, auditor, treasurer, lands commissioner, and insurance commissioner. Up until 92, those were mostly Republicans. From 80 to 88, Republicans won 14 of the 24 seats, elections for those 8 offices. Since 1992, Republicans have won another 14, and Democrats have won 51, to the point where it is now totally, there isn't a Republican elected official statewide here in the state. So not only have the Democrats control all of the state executive offices, they've controlled the governor's mansion since 1984, as I pointed out. They've controlled the House of Representatives since 2002, and they've controlled the Senate in 16 out of the last 23 years, including all of them since 2018. And our congressional delegation has gone from 5 to 4, the Democrat advantage, to now it's 8 and 2. So Republicans have lost in Washington state for a generation. Half of today's electorate was not eligible to vote the last time Washington elected a Republican in a statewide office. Underlying this, these election results, of course, is changes in party identification. So in Washington, we don't register by party in order to vote like you do in, I think, most states. So the only time anybody has to declare what their party is when I call them on the phone and ask them in a survey, which I have been doing regularly since the early 1990s. And by regular, I mean 4 to 10 times a year. And here's the results. Very clear. Well, this is my favorite chart. This is exactly the kind of chart that the graphics people said never make a chart like this. But it indicates that party ID in Washington State is variable. But the Republicans have not been at 30%. People who say they would register as Republican have not been at 30% since 2012. And they've not held 30% average over the course of a year since 2006. So this sort of makes it a little more clear. So this is rolling up average party ID over the course of these administrations. So throughout the decade of the 90s, there was a 2-point advantage for the Democrats overall. So essentially at par. I used to say in those times that Washington had was party ID was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and independents were the largest third. And as a matter of fact, going into the 2000 election, Republicans had a 1-point advantage in ID in that year 2000. But as you see, it's been widening ever since. So it's gone from D+2 to D+17, and it started to widen with the Bush administration. I would say in those times that George Bush was very good for the Democratic Party in Washington State, and as you see as it goes along, Donald Trump was even better for the Democrats here. There was some turbulence recently during the Biden administration, even though the gap is largest there. In 2022, remember there was the talk of the red wave was coming, and it was showing up here. The Republican identification had shrunk the gap down to 7 points, and then came the Dobbs decision, reversing Roe v. Wade, and immediately, and I mean immediately, the Republican momentum collapsed, and the advantage went back up to 17 points for the Democrats. So we've talked a lot in Washington State about the Cascade curtain. I don't want to go into some of that. It's reflective of a national phenomenon. Yeah. I got some PowerPoint chunks. That's it. That's my big trick. Bill Bishop came out with this book in 2008, The Big Sword, talking about how people are literally voting with their feet. About 5% of the population in the country moves every year. And what's happening is people are moving into areas where people are more like them, which is, not too surprising. But in the last congressional election, only 16 out of 435 congressional districts split their ticket between Republican and Democrat for Congress and President, including 0 in Washington and 0 in Oregon. So Joe Biden won more votes in 2020, but fewer counties than any presidential candidate in history. Single party counties in the country, that is 80% voting one way or the other, increased from 81 such counties in 2000 to 476 in 2020. And 60% of all the counties in the country voted for their winning candidate by 20% or more. So we're getting more homogenous geographically. So turning into red and blue America, these maps indicate sort of what's been going on there. They're quite literally dividing the country politically, resulting in more and more one-party districts, which makes legislating more difficult because of polarized legislatures across the country and in Congress. That just make it harder for people to get work done in the legislative bodies. So this is the big sword at work in Washington. On the left, that's the classic Cascade curtain. This has been the model for years. All blue on the west side of the Cascades, all red on the east side of the Cascade, except for Lewis County there, which I always sort of looked to me like Eastern Washington giving the finger to Western Washington. So they've always voted Republican. Patty Murray, in her 2004 election, won 16 of the 39 counties. She got 55% of the vote. By 2024, she won 12 counties, fewer counties, but got 57% of the vote. And you see what happened there is along the coast, some of the coastal counties, including my old hometown, Grays Harbor, started to vote Republican, which Grays Harbor County, until 2016, when they voted for Trump, had not voted for Republican since Herbert Hoover, and voted for Trump. The Hoover vote worked out really well for them, so they said they try it again, and they're still voting Republican now. So Trump got 26 counties. He got 36% of the vote here. Tiffany Smiley and Lauren Culp, Senate and governor candidates last time, each got 43% of the counties. They each carried the same counties. They all carried the same counties with one exception, toggling back. And Whitman County, where we're standing, was one of the counties that kind of toggle back and forth. Whitman County tends to vote blue in presidential years and red in off years. But you see, if we had an electoral college by county, Republicans would be winning everything. And this map, which I really like, illustrates why they don't. This is households in Washington State, down at household level. I like it for a lot of reasons. It shows the real population distribution of the state, how much unpopulated land there is in Washington, especially in eastern Washington. And then the concentration there in the Puget Sound area. So in a statewide election, 60% of the voters of the state live inside that circle. So you don't need that many votes, that many areas if you're a Democrat. Scoop Jackson, a longtime senator from here, used to say you could see all the votes you needed from the top of the Space Needle. And it's even probably more true now. I've got a taller building and more people, so it's even more true now. So here's, so over there is Whitman County. You can see what that would, guess where Pullman is. And then Spokane County, you see a little more, more population, but some more diversity. And then it gets blue right around the Spokane, Spokane proper. And then here's Seattle. So when you talk about the big sort, you see people in Seattle, they just don't run into many Republicans at the Safeway. Because it's a 75% blue state, or city. So I like this. This is a couple years ago. Idaho realtors luring conservatives, come on over to Idaho, you'll be more at home. And so this is real. People are trying to make money off it. This is a real thing. And so the Secretary of State of Idaho actually did a study, I think a year or two ago, and looked at the most recent 20,000 people who moved from Washington to Idaho, and 62% of them registered as Republican when they got to Idaho. And the Californians, it was 80% who registered as Republican. So it's actually working. So the most profound aspect of the big sort is not that people want to live by other people who are like them. There's nothing new in that. It's the consequence of the sorting that mentioned earlier. It results in single party district. So in a one party district, nobody has to worry about getting beaten by the other party. They're always looking over their shoulder at the more extreme wing of their own party. So if elected officials never have to appeal to the other party, the ideology tends to narrow. So Washington likes to think that we're immune from that, most of these national trends, and to an extent we are. But this is the distribution of legislative districts in Washington State. That's 1980. So there's 3 legislators per district, 1 senator, 2 representatives. And in 1980s, you see a plurality, 20 out of the 49 districts, sent a mixed party delegation, at least 1 member from each party in their delegation to the state legislature. By 2020, that had dwindled to 4, and actually now there's only 2. So there are no Republican legislators from King County, and there are no Democrats from Eastern Washington outside of the city of Spokane. So when the legislature's meeting, in their party caucuses, before they go out on the floor to vote, there's no King County voice in the Republican caucus, and there's only 1 or 2 Democratic voices in the 1 or 2 Eastern Washington voices in the Democratic caucus. So the top 2 primary we have here, where you don't vote by party and the 2 top vote getters advance, is supposed to mitigate against more extremism in the politics. And I think the jury's still out on that. So if anyone here is looking for a master's thesis topic, I would point you to the effect of the top 2 primary on ideology in the legislature. So underlying these changes in the government structure, the partisan balance of government, has been a change in the makeup of the parties themselves. Alan Abramowitz in 2018 published this look at 40 years of polling and election data. And from that, he concluded that the 2 parties have sorted themselves, not just by geography, as we've seen, but also by gender, age, race, education, and ideology, to an extent that's unprecedented. There's always been, more women identify as Democrats. That's been going on for a long time, and that sort of thing. But the extent of it is unprecedented. And there's some indication that some of that may be changing. It's a dynamic thing, and it's not absolute, of course. And something may be changing in this election. We don't know, but the sorting he found was pretty pronounced. So here in Washington, in one generation, here was so in 2000, people under 50 years old were evenly divided between whether they would register as a Republican or as a Democrat. 1 point difference. By 2024, there was a 28-point shift toward women identifying as Democrats. Well, that was 1850. 16-point shift among women, 18 points for King County, and a 30-point shift among people with college degrees. So Washington State is among the highest educated state in the country. 52% of our voters are women. As you saw, 30% of the 30% of the state's voters are in King County and 60% in Central Puget Sound. And the average age of the population is going down. So none of those bode that well for the Republican Party going forward. So in the before times, both parties were big tents. They were coalitions of interests and issue positions. So contentious issues often got worked out within the parties. Then they more or less banded together and got behind their candidate as that candidate leaned into the center in the general election to try to win persuadable voters. That model seems to have been disappearing. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Movement, the Vietnam War, all served to start to divide people along demographic lines, age, gender, ethnicity, that sort of thing. And more importantly, these are variables that are aspects of identity. They are not just policy preferences. And again, this is not entirely new, but the degree to which these identities are more or less tightly bound now into political identities and separated by parties is relatively new. The degree is new. So party affiliation has gone from a preference to an identity to a dominant identity. So we have polling now shows that people would be more upset if their offspring married somebody from a different party than they would if they married somebody from a different race, which is a generation ago that was unheard of. But the party ID has become more salient and encompassing aspects of people's identity. So disagreements over policy thus are immediately partisan disagreements. It wasn't always like that. And they are defined and argued as values disagreements, which is seen as attack on my identity. So this development starts to explain why everything seems political and politics is so polarized. So both of these big tent parties that used to be were more or less centrist parties. They each had ideological wings as part of their coalitions, but the moderates in both parties held the balance of power for a long time. And as the parties have sorted ideologically, the activist ideological wings in each party have asserted more influence and have come to form the base instead of the wings of the parties, which has resulted in the center of gravity moving for each party and moving both parties away from what used to be the center of American politics. to an unprecedented degree, voters don't pick the party that fits their thinking. They pick the party that matches their identity and then form their policy preferences to line up with the party. So this, as beliefs and identities become sorted, the parties have become, therefore, more tribal, more us versus them, which is a powerful psychological trigger. So one of the more toxic aspects of that, in a self-perpetuating loop, is that the parties, because it's us versus them, is the demonization of the other party. What used to be worthy opponents, my worthy opponent I disagree with, are now dangerous traitors. In a survey at the beginning of this year, here in Washington State, 9 out of 10 people in each party, this was when Biden was still in the race, 9 out of 10 people in each party thought that the candidate of the other party was a danger to democracy. Not just unworthy of the office, not just misguided on policy, but an existential danger to democracy. So partisanship becomes defined in negative terms. I may not like my candidate, but I hate yours. So Trump wins because he's not Hillary Clinton. Biden wins because he's not Trump. I'm for X because they resent the same people I resent, and that's how party ID is for a large segment of the population comes to be identified. In our recent poll, just a week ago, 50% of the Harris voters in Washington State said it was more important to keep Trump out of the White House than to put her in. The reason they were voting for her was to keep Trump out of the White House. So politics rooted in us versus them tribal identity is not based on rational debate over public policy, but on identity and hating the other side. So it never ends. Tactically, tribalism leads to the corrosion of political norms as we devolve into an end justifies the means kind of politics. Things that used to be taboo are now tactics. When the other side is out to destroy America, then anything goes to stop them. We have a moral obligation to do everything we can to stop them, even if we have to bend the rules ourselves. So that's the cheery part of it. I never get invited for a second speech anymore. So where does that leave us? Well, the road ahead. Every election I can remember, and I can remember a lot of them, has been billed as the most important election of our lifetime. But this one really feels like it really is. So in Washington, we have nationally, this is probably the most consequential election of our lifetime. Locally, we're electing a new governor. At least half of those state executives that I showed you earlier, control of the state legislature, 2 open congressional seats, including one here and one on the west side, plus one of the closest congressional seats in the country over in Southwest Washington, and a highly contested in the 4th. So typically, that would be a very exciting year in Washington State. But we looked early, again, this was early on. We asked people this was the start of the year, which is better for our state government? Should the Democrats had control for all this time, as I pointed out. Should that maintain, or should the Republicans take over, or should we have divided government? Everybody pays a lot of lip service to divided government. We should have divided government. That's what's really going to work best. In our poll, only 25% said that was the best solution, the best outcome. But on the other hand, 53% there said something other than the status quo, which is the Democrats controlling everything. They either said divided or the Republicans should control That's a majority, 53%. Then we asked them later in the same poll, how are you going to vote? 52%. I'd vote for all the Democrats. So it's a little hard to achieve this ideal of divided government. It said, you guys do that. I'm voting for who I want to. So, nationally, we have a closely divided national race, as close as anyone has seen in a long, long time. But Washington remains a fairly Democrat-leaning state. So this is, as I told you, the only time you declare your party ID is when I ask you. So this is from our recent, we've done a couple of polls in the last 6 weeks, and I'm done now. I'm usually in my undisclosed location now. So we asked, how would you register if you had to register to vote? And then we asked independents, how do you typically vote? You vote for more Republicans or more Democrats? This is the total. So 52% is a Democrat voting state, 35% Republican. So we've got all these statewide elections coming up, and here are the recent poll results. So we've got president, U.S. Senate, a generic congressional question, a generic legislature question, the governor's race, attorney general, lands commissioner. What's striking here is it's the same chart all the way across. Instead of this exciting year, which in times gone by, this would have been a very engaging, exciting Washington election, it's kind of a yawn. It shows what happens when there's almost no party competition. It's almost a foregone conclusion. And this race shows how partisan the races have become, and also shows one of the effects of a one-party dominant state. We used to split our tickets. Don't do that much anymore. So each of these races, I'm pointing here, each of these races, except the last one, which I'll talk about in a minute, is within the margin of error of the party identification of people. Now, this won't be the exact, I'm going to be interested to draw this chart with the actual votes in a couple of weeks, or a month, whenever we get done counting the votes. They're all, as I say, they're all in the same narrow band of variation, except for lands commissioner, where Jamie Herrera Butler, the ousted congressional Republican who got booted out of office for voting against the impeachment, is now running for lands commissioner against Dave Updegrove, a King County council person. She's close. There's 6-point difference and about 24% undecided, so there's a real shot there. But note that she's got the same Republican vote, and he is lagging behind the Democratic vote. So what looks like, superficially at least, is that the Democrats haven't yet coalesced behind Updegrove, and that's like if that happens in the last 2 weeks, then that chart will look like the rest. Her task is to get those as many of those 24% she can, and keep that Democratic vote down. And as I say, she has a shot at that. But that's the only race that doesn't just look like a pretty straight party vote. So, what does this mean? What lies ahead? Where are we? The answer is, we don't know. There are fault lines in the system that have been exposed that will need to be addressed over time. Politics is not working for a large segment of the population. This was, from a survey early in the year. We asked people to grade this is Washington voters, we asked them to grade the American political system. They gave it a D. 33% gave it an F, and another 29% gave it a D. I don't know about you, if I took that report card home, I'd be in trouble. And then 9 in 10 said they were worried about the future of democracy heading into this year They were worried about the future of democracy. And this was the same poll where both candidates were seen as a danger to democracy by the opposite parties. So the founders designed a system of divided control with checks and balances. It was designed to force deliberation and compromise. Two things that the founders were most worried about were democracy and strong parties. Well, political parties were forming before George Washington even left office, and democracy has been expanding ever since the earliest days of the Republic. And, we've come to understand or believe that party competition is necessary for a healthy democracy. In a society as large and diverse as ours, parties bring together coalitions and organize choices for voters. But now, as we've seen, and we're watching every day, we have two parties that are polarized along identity characteristics. And we have an evenly divided nation politically. Our current politics works against compromise from several self-reinforcing angles, as I tried to show. Both parties have fundamental internal divisions, and these internal divisions are playing out and reshaping the future of our politics in ways we can't really anticipate. Clearly, there are two very different futures depending on the outcome of the presidential election. Very different futures for the country, but also for the parties, which are supposed to organize our politics. Donald Trump has been the unifying voice, or unifying force for both parties while he's been on the scene. So what happens? What does each party look like if Trump wins? One could speculate that the Republican Party that once was is gone, and it really becomes a MAGA party, and the moderates leave and do something else with moderates that are left. But if that happens, what's happening on the Democratic side? That means that Harris loses. That means the factors, the forces inside the Democratic Party start to exert, having their own internal struggles, I won't call it civil war, struggles for the control of that party. There'll be a lot of blaming and shaming and finger pointing, and if we'd only done it our way, we would have won that last election, and that'll go on for a while, and that'll settle out. If Trump loses, what happens? Do the moderates in the Republican Party make a comeback? Does Liz Cheney lead a moderate comeback on the Republican side? Harris will be president. She's unlikely to have both houses of Congress, and both parties will say, she will have won by about 12 votes. So both factions, all the factions in the Democratic Party, will claim we won because of us. We provided those 12 votes, and so there'll be tremendous pressure on her throughout, but unified by the fact that they do, in fact, hold the White House. So this election that we're facing is not going to resolve this current impasse. There's not going to be any mandate coming out of this election. The winner will claim one, but the losing party will not let him get away with that. And further, ironically, I guess, almost, the losing party will have no incentive to cooperate and compromise, because they're going to think they were only 12 votes away from controlling the White House or the Congress. And so when the balance of power is that tight, there isn't, the incentives work against compromise. The two-party system works best, and maybe multi-party system work best when there is a more dominant party and a loyal opposition. Because then, in order to get anything done, the loyal opposition has to compromise to accomplish anything. When it's this tight, everyone is angling to get that next seat. So the incentive is to tear down the opposition rather than cooperate with them. I don't think this current gridlock that we've actually been in for a few cycles now, it will dissipate when one of the two parties, however those are configured, whatever they look like a year from now, one of the two parties manages to expand their electoral coalition to win a convincing majority. That's when this deadlock will start to dissipate. It's not going to just flip a switch and fever breaks and all of a sudden it's all, everybody's holding hands again. It's not going to happen that way. So I'd like to end on an optimistic note. And so I do choose to be hopeful, but we are probably looking at a generation. It's going to be up to you. Before the dynamics that we're been experiencing really settle out. So,
Okay. We have about 15 minutes for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. This isn't the first time we've been deeply polarized as a country, and not the first time we've been deeply polarized along demographic and identity-based lines. In fact, Robert Putnam's new book, I don't know if you've read that, Upswing. Yeah. He says we are a lot like we were at the turn of the 20th century. And so how did we get at that deep polarization then? His argument was we did it through institutional reforms, right? Expanding the franchise and the progressive reforms to the civil services and things like that. Are there institutional fixes to the problem we're in? And you talked about one of them, that's the top two primary, that may or may not be working very well, but I think a more promising one is ranked choice voting. Yeah. And that's on the ballot in a number of states right now. What do you think about that?
Well, I know that gets a lot of currency, and it's been tried here a couple of places. Pierce County did it once, and most of the establishment powers say it's too complicated, it won't work, but it does work in places. So I mean, we're going to have to see. I mean, it's it would start to break this dichotomy that really is forcing these fossilized two parties. There's a majority for a lot of public policy out there in the public, but neither party is really articulating that, and they don't move off of their ideological positions enough to capture that. And the other thing that is getting some currency now, which seems even harder to accomplish here, maybe, who knows, is multi-party. So that the coalitions that used to take place inside the two parties take place between among the parties now. So everybody can have their ideological party, but you have to have a coalition to govern, which takes place in every other democracy, right? Except ours, right? We're the only ones that have this two-party, rigid two-party system. All the others, you form a government by reaching out, compromising with some other party. So both of those would militate against the situation we're in, but both seem very difficult. Maybe just because we're so used to this system, but with it on the ballot in many states, it looks like it's going to get a trial. And that's the laboratories of democracy, right? The states get to try this, and if it works out, it gets other states try it, and maybe it happens. I was thinking about how this changes. What's going to happen, and everything seems impossible. And there was a quote in Ernest Hemingway book about asked how this guy in the book, how he went bankrupt. And he said, well, very slowly, and then all of a sudden. And that seems like kind of where we are. We got these fault lines, and maybe there's a big earthquake coming, and some big institutional change like that suddenly becomes possible and feasible, and we move forward. It's happened before. We're 150 years since the Whigs or something like that. We haven't had a real realignment in a while. So something's going to break. I mean, it just seems untenable that we can continue on this knife's edge and make progress as a society. Long non-answer.
On those solutions, because ideally I definitely agree, but every time these conversations come up, I always think of the lack of general civic education in many Americans and just American political culture. So how do you think that interacts with these kind of reforms to the system, which are ideal, but
yeah, I think it interacts a lot. I mean, I think, certainly a lot of people decry the withering away of civics education in schools, and I'm one of them. I mean, I think people don't have an appreciation for how this is supposed to work. And one of the things that I have, and you would get that in school, and it wouldn't necessarily, and I've thought about that too, because I'm thinking, can you imagine trying to put together a civics curriculum for high school in this atmosphere? I mean, the school board meetings would be, explosive. And what I started getting to was, it's not, civic education is not, how does a bill become a law? I mean, that's what we usually think of. It's more, how do we get along with each other? How do we disagree? I was rereading your book, Civility and Democracy, and how do we have democracy is a conversation about where we're going. And it seems more like a family feud now, but how can we have a conversation? So maybe it's civility education as much as civics education, because it gets people used to cooperating with each other, and that might be the way in, because I just can't imagine a civics education curriculum that wouldn't be as controversial as everything else now. So that's kind of a new idea I'm trying to have, but I agree that it needs to start early on. And a civil education wouldn't be a curriculum. It'd be integrated into all. You have to be more civil in your math class. So you learn how to be a democratic small d citizen by cooperating.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the methodology of your polling, kind of what's unique about polling in Washington State, and also what changes have you made over time in your methods to try to keep up and prevent those polling failures we've seen elsewhere?
Yeah. Well, it's changed a bit. So these polls, the monthly poll or quarterly poll I do now, based on 400 sample of 400 people, so that's plus or minus 5 for margin of error, and it's registered voters. And in Washington State, I can get a list of registered voters, so I know that they're registered before I call them. And then our last poll was likely voters, so I can say this person has voted at least once in the last 3 years or 2 years, so they're likely to vote this time, so I can sort that way. On national polls, that's cost prohibitive most of the time. So the random sample polls nationally are random dial and then ask a series of questions and determine who's a likely voter that way. But you're relying on people telling you. So that's that part of it. We have, when I started this, of course, when I started this, we still had operator telephones. There was, you crank up and number please, and none of you even know what I'm talking about. We used to do all telephone surveys by landline. Well, that's gone. So these surveys are, we get the voter list, we have phone numbers, so we dial landlines if we have them, cell phones if we have them, and then we text the cell phone. So it's a combination multi-mode of these three types. So, and our last survey, more than half of them were done by text because it's just harder and harder to reach people. And the response rate has gone down and down to the point where, and this is where the polls, this is what keeps us up at night, is who's not answering, and are they different than people who are answering, and was the source of the misses in 2016 and 2020 was non-response. So we will, to get our 400, we will dial the phone 40,000 times. And we call back, so we're not 40,000 people, but close to that. And it used to be well over half would answer. So part of what happens then is you get your survey and you say, okay, now is this, you didn't have to worry before about it being a representative sample because everybody was responding. So now you have to really look at it and say, do I need to adjust this? Do I need to wait? We don't have enough people who don't have a college education, or we have too many people, who are in this age group. So there's more adjusting that way. A lot of the national polls also, more and more, you'll see all these. Another thing that's happened is the explosion of polls. I mean, when I started, there were 5. Now there's 5 a day at least in every state. But they're doing panels and they're doing online surveys. So companies will maintain these huge panels of people. That is, people who have agreed to do surveys, and they recruit them either by a random recruit and get them to mail and call them and say we do it, and they agree to take a survey every once in a while, and they get some reward for it usually, gift card or token toward something like that. And from that, and by large, I mean millions of people in this panel. So when they're going to do a survey, they say, okay, we need this percent of people over 65, we need this percent of men and women, so on and so on. And then they match that way and then adjust it that way. So a lot of the national polls are being done that way, and a lot of them are blending. So they do some random and some that way. The reality is polling is trying to keep up with the changing technology. I think eventually it's going to all be online, but you can't get a random sample of email addresses. So it's just harder to do. So they're actually developing new statistics to replace the margin of error, which is based on a probability sample, because that's not what people are doing. So it's all changing while pollsters try to keep up. Me, I'm going to retire before all that. I don't want to have to learn anything new.
So we have time for one more question for this one. Okay, well, if not, before we thank our guests, let me remind you again, this is one of our, in our ongoing series on the 2024 election. Next week, we have Emily LaRosa from Michigan State, who'll be talking about the use of AI in campaigns. And it'll be same time, same place next week. And now join me in thanking Stuart Elway for a really great.
Well, save democracy. Up to you.